The Justice Beat is dedicated to the 1 in 3 Americans touched by incarceration. The Justice Beat is where we discuss all things justice.
Today's topic, the growing trend of prosecuting protesters, a look at Arizona. Judge William Billy Murphy Jr. As the firm's founder and senior partner, Judge William H. Billy Murphy Jr. stands on a respected legacy of legal counsel. He has been a Baltimore trial attorney for decades, aggressively and effectively handling a broad range of ongoing cases. With a 90% success rate in state court cases, Judge Murphy knows how to navigate complex legal matters. He also holds a 40% success rate in federal cases, which is 4 times higher than the national average, 9%. His 40-plus years of practice in and out of the courtroom have equipped Judge Murphy to advocate for clients from all backgrounds and walks of life. Boasting a reputation as an expert litigator with a calm, calculated approach, Judge Murphy prides himself on getting to the truth. When you ask those who know him well to describe the man who leads a majority of Murphy, Falcon, and Murphy's toughest cases, you'll hear the words imaginative, leader, calm, and team builder. When you need a composed, precise, and effective litigation lawyer in your corner, turn to Judge Murphy. Steve Benedetto is the founder of the People's Law Firm in Phoenix, Arizona. A former Arizona State Supreme Court clerk, Steve spent the first part of his career doing complex legal work in prestigious law firms. Then, in August of 2014, Steve was changed forever by watching news coverage of the murder of Michael Brown in St. Louis, Missouri, and the militarized police response to nonviolent protesters that followed. He left his practice to focus his work on defending survivors of police violence and other civil rights abuses. Heather Hamel Robles grew up in a multiracial family. Seeing her siblings treated differently, based on their varying appearances to the outside world, left an inedible imprint of her at a relatively young age. By the time she was a teenager, Heather realized that what might be a routine traffic stop for her as a white passing woman was very different for her younger brother with darker skin. For Heather, the law was always a calling. But her life experience meant that her path in the law would always be focused on making change, impacting and attempting to eradicate the very systems of oppression she witnessed growing up. This led to one place, the University of California, Berkeley.
Good morning, Justice Beat family, and to our Justice Beat family on Real STL News. We are back for another edition of the Justice Beat Talk Show, and today is dedicated to our monthly legal hour with our moderator, Billy Murphy. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Billy Murphy. I'm a lawyer in Baltimore, and I'm happy to be back for this episode of Justice Beat.
All right, and we have 2 guests that our moderator will be interviewing this morning, and they are with the People's Law Firm, Heather Hamel and Steve Benedetto. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us.
Glad to have you, and we can't wait to get started. It's in your hands, Billy.
Thank you very much. The title of this show is Arizona's Oppression of Protesters. It's a serious problem. It has become a much more serious problem recently in the wake of various allegations of misconduct and police brutality across the country. And it has become so bad in Arizona that there have been organized efforts to target the leaders of the protests before the protests ever began, with the express intent of arresting them on any trumped up charges they can manufacture. Now, I know this may sound to some people like a fantasy tale, but our guests are here today to show you and to explain to you why this is still going on. And the focus of this show is what's going on in Arizona. And it's so compelling that I and my law firm have decided to get involved with our 2 guests so that we can do what is necessary to get justice and to prohibit this kind of police and prosecutorial misconduct from ever happening again in Arizona. The good fortune that we found when we decided to get involved were these two folks. Heather Robles and Steve Benedetto are courageous activists who put themselves at risk almost every day because they are so outraged by what happened that they have become irresistible forces against what we hope will not be an immovable object. And so let's start out first with Heather. And Heather, why don't you explain the origin of give us a little taste of your background, the 25-cent version, and tell us how you started the People's Law Firm.
Well, thank you so much. So I've been an activist for a long time. And in 2010, I decided to go to law school. 2010 was the year that Arizona passed SB 1070, which is a now infamous law that legalized racial profiling of immigrants here in Arizona. It was a law that was pushed for then by Joe Arpaio, who is a notoriously racist sheriff, who was sheriff at the time, who needed another tool to allow him to continue to racially profile immigrants here in Arizona and target them for arrest.
Now stop for a minute. Joe Arpaio was the same sheriff that was pardoned by Donald Trump.
Yes.
And who has notoriously prosecuted people for racist reasons during his entire term as a sheriff of Arizona.
Yes.
And how long was he the sheriff?
Oh, about 20 years, a little over 20 years. He was sheriff for 2 decades. It was a very rough couple of decades here in Arizona. He finally got booted out of office in 2016.
So the first 6 years of your involvement as a protester was while he was still reigning supreme with his approach to law enforcement.
Yep.
So, okay, you're in 2010. What happened next?
2010, I go to law school. I went to Berkeley Law School, which is a great place to get a progressive education. Went to Berkeley Law, came out, started working for a big law firm called Perkins Coie. It's a national law firm. I did some political law there, but ultimately wasn't able to do the sort of activist work that I wanted to, working at a big corporate law firm. So I worked there for about a year. And
Perkins Coie is known for its representation of big tech. Their biggest clients are the biggest technology firms in the United States. Who are some of those firms?
I mean, the tech firms, I don't know a ton about. I do know we represented the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party. That's something that Perkins Coie is deeply involved in. And Newmont Mining, Boeing airplanes. Those were some of our clients. So yeah, it was a big corporate law firm with some huge companies that we represented.
So how did you make the transition from them to protesting?
I mean, I think I just decided that practicing law in that way, while I was deeply grateful for the mentors that I had at Perkins Coie, I just decided that wasn't my path. And so I left and along with a couple of friends who were activists, helped found an organization called Justice That Works that was focused on addressing policing issues and issues of mass incarceration in Arizona, and became a frontline activist again, and was doing that work for almost 5 years before Steve pulled me away. And Steve actually started the People's Law Firm and was like, hey, you need to get back into the practice of law. Would like you to come here And this can be a home for you because this is a space where you can fuse all the tactics that you use in frontline activism, and you can work for all the causes that you do, and you can do it in the courtroom, which was something that, you know, I had really only thought about in theory, and Steve, you know, made a reality.
Well, let's segue into Steve. Steve, tell us your background and how you started the People's Law Firm.
Steve, you're on mute.
That has happened more times than I can count since March of 2020. So I moved from the East Coast. I grew up in South Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, moved out to Arizona to go to law school, and followed a very similar path to Heather. As you know, Billy, law school is kind of set up so that when you get good grades, the big corporate law firms swoop in and try to recruit you to go work for them. Did that for 5 years, kept my time in 6-minute increments. And two things kind of led me to start the firm. One was shortly after I left the big firm practice and started my own criminal defense firm. I was doing a lot of white collar work towards the end of my big firm practice. It was right around the time of the housing crisis, and a lot of our corporate clients kind of disappeared. And so when I transitioned that white collar practice, which was really just regular crimes for people with a lot of money, into my own practice, I realized that the quality of the plea offers I was getting dropped drastically. I went from being able to negotiate great plea offers for predominantly white clients that were very well funded, to getting large prison sentence offers for predominantly people of color that weren't well funded. And very little had changed other than the race and financial backing of my clients and not having a big corporate name on the top of the pleading. Otherwise, the crimes were substantively similar. So I saw that and realized right away what Ben Crump has very publicly referred to as two systems of justice in this country. And that was kind of the foundation for it when I first started seeing that in 2009. But it wasn't until 2014, one night in August, sitting on my couch and just kind of scrolling through the channels, when I saw armored vehicles on the street and big mounted machine guns and a line of what looked like soldiers, and watching CNN thinking I was looking at something in the Middle East. And then the byline popped up and it said Ferguson, Missouri. And I saw Don Lemon reporting from the streets of Ferguson, and I saw tear gas canisters, and they looked like rockets being shot through the air. And I realized what I was doing at that time, trying to run a criminal defense and personal injury practice, wasn't enough. I had to use my educational privilege, my financial privilege, my white privilege, my male privilege in some kind of different way. So I looked for a civil rights firm to go work for, and Phoenix is tremendously underserved in terms of the civil rights bar, and couldn't find anybody that was doing this work that was doing this work regularly. So I decided to start a firm myself. And after a couple of difficult years trying to make that work, represented Heather in a case and convinced her to come practice.
You let that part out, Heather.
Mhm.
So now tell folks what's going on in Arizona that is so significant that it is beginning to get national attention.
Well, this is sort of a long story. It's got multiple parts, mainly because it has been occurring realistically for multiple years, but in particular, from May until for the past year. It's been happening for the past year. So I'll start where this story actually starts, which is on May 25th of 2020. There were 2 deaths that took place in the US. The first, most of us are familiar with, which was the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. And the second took place in Phoenix. On that same day in Phoenix, another unarmed Black father who was sleeping in his car was murdered while sleeping in his car by a police officer working for the Department of Public Safety in Arizona. Those 2 deaths happened on the same day. And as we all know, the murder of George Floyd caused protests nationwide. Phoenix was no exception. Phoenix was also out there protesting the death of Deon Johnson. So there were thousands of people who immediately took to the streets, rightfully so, expressing their outrage, expressing their grief, expressing their anger. And they were met with a huge show of force, not dissimilar from how police responded in every other city in the country. Police responded with indiscriminate use of tear gas, with indiscriminate use of pepper spray, indiscriminate use of rubber bullets, of beanbags. And over those first 4 nights of that uprising in Phoenix PD arrested 354 people, which is a massive amount of people to arrest in 4 days. Most of those arrests occurred over a 2-day period, starting on May 30th. So what Phoenix PD started doing on May 30th was they just decided after 2 days of protests that they had had enough of this. And they just started arresting anybody who happened to be in downtown Phoenix. Didn't matter if they were protesters or not. Phoenix PD just basically said, if you're in this area right now, we're arresting you. And they stopped vehicles. They were approaching guns. They stopped traffic. They were approaching vehicles with weapons drawn, guns drawn, pulling people out of cars, including children, throwing them onto the sidewalk, arresting them, and then impounding those cars.
You mean without any probable cause that they had committed any crimes whatsoever?
Yep, without any probable cause. Once they threw them out of vehicles or arrested them on the street, they then placed them into vans. And we don't know if these vans had working AC. If they did, it's very, very clear that that AC wasn't turned on or wasn't functioning properly, because they threw all these folks who had been heavily doused in like tear gas or pepper spray in the middle of a pandemic into close quarters in vans, in hot vans, where they held them for like 6 to 8 hours. And this is Arizona in the middle of the summer.
The typical temperatures out there in the summer are 106 to 113. Been there during the summer. It's brutal.
It's really, really brutal.
So they were held in the hot sun with the windows closed in these police vans and cars.
Yep. Well, I mean, they were held at night, so it wasn't the temperature might have gone down a little bit. It wasn't quite in the sun, but it was still, you know, even when the sun goes down here in Phoenix, it's still like 90 degrees. And yeah, they were held in hot vehicles for hours on end. They weren't given bathroom breaks. Many individuals, because they were in such close contact with a lot of chemical weapons, and then placed into these vans, a lot of them wound up having lots of medical issues. Lots of individuals wound up vomiting on themselves. Some individuals ended up involuntarily urinating on themselves while they were held in these vans. And then they were booked into jail, where again, they were held in close quarters with other individuals, you know, sneezing and coughing on each other in the middle of a global pandemic. And when Phoenix PD booked them into jail, they booked everyone into jail for felony rioting. And they used the same exact probable cause statement. They cut and pasted it onto everybody's probable cause statements to justify their arrests. Now, this probable cause statement—
Meaning that they fabricated probable cause for everybody, and it was the same fabrication?
Yes.
And
exactly.
so all they did, instead of writing out individually what each person had done, if anything, to have committed a crime, they just substituted this fictitious statement, and it was the same statement for all 350 people?
Yes. So 114 people were arrested that night, but yeah, it was the same statement for all those people.
So I'm sure that some judge was outraged by that.
Yeah, as soon as these cases started getting into court and the judges started reading these probable cause statements, the first times I read these probable cause statements, the judges threw out the cases anyway, because they said, you haven't articulated what you believe this individual did or what crimes you think this individual committed. But then by the time they realized this is the same cut and paste statement for everybody, then they started getting really outraged. I think at first there were judges who thought, this is just lazy and sloppy police work because you guys didn't include any information to justify this person's arrest. And then when they realized, oh, you've done a mass arrest using the same cut and paste statement, then they got outraged. They threw out almost all these cases immediately before these individuals even got released from jail.
Now stop there for a second. Steve, what happened next?
From that point, our firm got involved. Heather was intimately involved in getting a lot of these folks out of jail and identifying these copy and paste statements. And there were several additional days of protests. But the major point is that night, the night of May 31st, there was another protest. At this point, the governor had seen these mass protests, these mass arrests from the night before, and used that as cover to implement an 8 p.m. curfew, with no exceptions for First Amendment rights. And from
8 p.m. while it was still light outside?
While it was still light, and yeah, the end of May, the sun's going down probably 10 p.m., still light, still daylight hours, 8 p.m. curfew, with virtually no exceptions other than like medical emergencies. And
that sounds illegal to me.
That is one of the issues our firm has been working on, is that curfew issue, because Phoenix PD used that curfew as cover to arrest an additional 354 people that evening, just by virtue of the fact that they were out after 8 p.m. And that included people that were protesting. It also included people who were walking around their neighborhood. It included motorists driving home from restaurants. And it took another couple of days before the media really started to latch on to what was happening. And when they started reporting it, Phoenix PD suddenly realized this probably isn't the best approach. We're getting a lot of flack over this publicly, and they altered their tactics.
So of the 300 and some that were arrested that night, how many of them were released or had their cases dismissed?
And that's an interesting point I left out, which is what we've seen from Phoenix PD is really impressively quickly evolving tactics. So that the May 30th night was a Saturday night, and that night they charge everyone with felonies. And in Arizona, felonies go before an initial appearance judge, who's a judge or a commissioner, and that individual has the responsibility of determining probable cause, and that's what Heather described. All of those cases, or most of them, were immediately dismissed. The next night, Phoenix PD smartened up and said, we don't want to be in front of a superior court judge on this, so let's just charge everybody with misdemeanors. And within the misdemeanor system, people can still be held for up to 48 hours. So there's still that pressure on someone who's arrested to try to get out of there. But in the misdemeanor system, they don't have to have the probable cause determination. Instead, they meet on the spot with an assigned prosecutor who offers them a plea agreement. So what we saw was a large number of teenagers and college-age kids that were taking plea agreements and pleading guilty because the offer was they wouldn't serve any more time. It was for time served. They wouldn't even pay a fine as long as they pled guilty to violating an emergency order. So we saw a number of people who accepted plea agreements. As far as we know, everybody who didn't accept plea agreements, every single person ultimately saw their charges dismissed. As far as we know, nobody went to trial, was convicted, and very few people even accepted plea agreements after that date. But we believe—
Well, that's probably in part because you all got involved.
What we have found, Billy, and I'm sure this is something you've seen over and over again in your very long and storied career, is this system doesn't operate very well when there's a spotlight being shined on what's happening. And that's something Heather and I try to do, is shine a spotlight on what's going on. And once we got involved and the media started to pay attention to the fact that we were working on these cases, then reporting starting to happen. And I would credit the local media far more, frankly, than our law firm, but sometimes our presence can key the media into issues they should be paying attention to.
Now, Heather, tell the public what the significance of having a felony charge is. What are the consequences of that, other than what happens to you in court?
Yeah, so there's a few consequences. One, even getting charged with a felony can have serious implications for housing and employment. So many apartment complexes or many rentals here in Arizona, they won't just ask you to check a box saying, have you been convicted of a previous felony? Most of those rental applications will ask you, have you ever been arrested for a felony? And we'll run a background check. And if you answer yes to that question, even if you don't wind up convicted, a lot of places will still deny you housing based on a simple arrest, which is outrageous. Obviously, that's a massive issue we have to work on here in Arizona. But even an arrest can have major implications.
What about employment?
Employment, same with employers. A lot of employers, before they hire you, will run background checks. And if you're charged with what sounds like a violent felony or a serious felony, you can be denied employment on that basis.
What about healthcare, insurance, all of these kinds of things? Immigration status.
Immigration status is probably a big one. If you are undocumented and you wind up arrested, you can be placed immediately into immigration proceedings, especially because here in Arizona, ICE operates directly in our jails. And so individuals who are booked into jail also go through an ICE screening, an ICE interview, and ICE will pick them up directly from that jail to take them to immigration facilities. If you're documented, meaning you're a recipient of Daca, if you're charged with a felony, you can get that.
Explain Daca to those in the audience who don't remember what it is.
Yeah, Daca is an Obama program. It stands for the Deferred Action Childhood Act. And basically it is an act that protects dreamers who are children who were brought to the US and are not citizens, but have been here since they were very young. Daca protects dreamers from deportation. And it's basically an act that says ICE is going to operate, and the Department of Homeland Security are going to operate their prosecutorial discretion not to place these individuals into immigration proceedings as long as they continue to renew their Daca status and as long as they meet certain requirements. And one of those is not being convicted of a felony. And so if you're charged with a felony, you can, if you have Daca, you can immediately be placed into immigration proceedings. And there were a few folks who were arrested on these nights, who were undocumented or documented, who immediately got placed into immigration proceedings. And at least one of those individuals was deported, wound up self-deporting after being transferred to Eloy, which is a notoriously brutal immigration facility.
Now, if you are put in these immigration facilities, is there a long wait before you can be adjudicated as to whether or not you've in fact violated Daca?
Yeah.
Do people get bail ordinarily while they're waiting for these proceedings to take place?
I mean, that's an option. So sometimes individuals can be awarded like an ankle monitor.
Yeah, but tell me what happens to most people.
Most people wind up being stuck in those immigration facilities.
So up to how long before they get a hearing?
It can be years.
Wow.
I mean, I've had clients before who have spent like 5 years in immigration proceedings in those facilities, which are prisons. And these are individuals who have, not been accused of committing crimes. And yeah, they'll be placed into those facilities for years.
Now, if they're charged falsely with crime, and until the charges are fairly adjudicated, this can form the basis for a long prison stretch.
Yes.
For somebody who committed no crime at all.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Now, I presume that the police in Arizona know all of these laws and know the consequences of charging people with felonies. That's their job. And so you had all of these demonstrators in day one charged with felonies. How many again were they?
In total, over that first 4 days, there were 354.
Charged with felonies?
I want to say probably about half of those, almost half of those individuals, probably around we know at least 114. I'm going to estimate between 114 and 150 were charged with felonies.
Now, during this period, during the aftermath, where you lawyers have now gotten involved, have you discovered misconduct by the prosecutors?
At this point, because all the charges got dismissed really easy, prosecutors weren't heavily involved at this point that we knew of. We found out later on, of course, there's like meetings and strategies about how to handle these protests, what to charge folks with and why. But at the time, the prosecutor's office wasn't involved because these cases had been dismissed so quickly.
Mm-hmm. But now, what did you find out in particular that the chief prosecutor had been doing in terms of planning this whole counterattack against these demonstrators?
Well, so we found that out probably not until early this year. I mean, I think that we had always assumed NCAO was highly involved in this. But I think to get to that answer, I'm going to shift into sort of what I call the second half of this story, which is the first half is really what happened over the first 4 nights. And the mass arrest tactics that Phoenix PD employed and what that looked like. And as soon as you see these cases being dismissed and the media start reporting on them, and then you have our law firm who's threatening a class action lawsuit, and that's being reported, you really see Phoenix PD sort of sufficiently scandalized. And so they shift tactics from these mass arrests into specifically targeting individuals. So between
did the idea for that come after the protests had taken place, or after the protests were announced and before they took place?
So they decided to target individuals before protests took place. We're not quite sure, who at Phoenix PD made the strategic decision to, hey, we need to stop conducting mass arrests, and instead we're going to conduct arrests that we think are going to have a major impact. And the arrests that make a major impact are when you arrest high-profile protesters, the people who are out in the streets every night, when you arrest civil rights leaders, when you arrest well-known organizers, when you arrest the leaders of well-known groups. Those are arrests that send a message to everyone.
But when you found out that people had been targeted, can you explain to our audience, Steve, what took place, how you uncovered what took place at the highest levels of government, meaning the prosecutors and the police executives, and what happened next?
Sure, and just by way of a little bit of brief background, after these mass arrests, these protests got a lot smaller, and the community, I think, was really shook by the fact that people were just being scooped up. So then we started to see these targeted arrests, as Heather mentioned, and our firm, as well as a lot of other firms, as well as local movement, were very involved in trying to defend these folks against what we believed were politically motivated charges, which were called by the media political prosecutions. And so as we started to see this unfold, we saw a number of protesters get arrested, including a gentleman who I assume Elaine and a lot of local staff is very familiar with, Bruce Franks Jr., a former Missouri representative and Ferguson protester who moved out here to Arizona, was asked to participate in a small protest for the commemoration of Michael Brown's death in August. Was about 50-person protest, completely nonviolent. He and 10 other people were arrested that day, or 9 other people were arrested that day. We had additional people, again, BLM leaders arrested in the subsequent days.
Black Lives Matter, you mean?
Black Lives Matter, local Black Lives Matter leaders were targeted and arrested after nonviolent protests, walking back to their vehicles. And then about a month after that, additional folks were arrested at a completely nonviolent protest.
Now, were they arrested on serious charges?
These protesters, compared to the original charges, which were mostly misdemeanors, were arrested on numerous felony accounts: aggravated assault on officers, resisting arrest, felony rioting, class 4 and class 5 and class 6 felonies in Arizona, which are punishable by years in prison, especially if you go to trial and lose. We're looking at potentially 4, 5, 10, 15-year prison sentences. And then it got worse because in October 17th, there was a protest of about 18 people, fairly novice protesters from what we understand. People that were not very involved in existing organizations. They were out in the street, walking around downtown Phoenix. When they were arrested, the police officer in charge of arresting them, who testified in front of the grand jury, testified that they were actually part of a criminal syndicate street gang that was as organized and potentially as dangerous as the Hells Angels, the Crips, and the Bloods. Testified to that under oath before a grand jury. And based on that testimony, the grand jury indicted these folks as gang members. And that's a separate offense in Arizona.
Or were they in fact gang members?
No.
Were they in fact a criminal organization?
Not even close, Billy. These were 19 and 20 and 21-year-old kids who were out chanting Black Lives Matter, hands up, don't shoot, and occasionally chanting ACAB, which is an acronym for All Cops Are Bastards, which dates back to labor union strikes in England in the 1940s. But the Phoenix police officer that testified under oath to the grand jury decided to label this the ACAB street gang, which was, as he labeled it again, organized for the purpose of committing assaults on and potentially seriously injuring police officers.
And the police made all of this up?
The police made all of this up. And from our perspective, representing some of these folks through the criminal process and investigating for possible civil rights violations, we didn't know exactly what the involvement of the prosecutor's office was, because all we're seeing in a grand jury transcript is what we often see in grand jury transcripts. You know, as you know, grand juries happen in secret. The defense attorney's not there, the defendant's not there. There's not even a date that's publicly posted when these are going to happen. As a defense attorney, you just get an indictment at some point and you found out your client was indicted. And so when we saw those grand jury transcripts eventually, what we realized
of what the prosecutors and the police had said to the grand jurors.
Exactly. That was the first time we realized it, but we still didn't know whether this was typical prosecutorial negligence, meaning they're just letting the police do what the police do, or whether the prosecutors were actively involved. And that was in October of 2020. And then in February of 2021, there was a series of local reporting by an ABC 15 journalist here in Phoenix named Dave Biscobing. And Biscobing did a series of reports that unveiled a litany of problems with these investigations that showed direct collusion between the prosecutor's office, who by statute and by constitution is supposed to be an independent arbiter of justice in Arizona, and this police department that was politically targeting their perceived political opponents. Black Lives Matter.
In a couple of sentences, what was the prosecution doing in collaboration with the police?
So what we've seen, and this is, understand this is still very much under investigation. There's multiple active investigations going on within Phoenix PD and within the Maricopa County Attorney's Office right now in response to what was found. But what we've seen from local reporting and also public records requests is there were actually meetings between the Maricopa County Attorney's Office deputy county attorney, who was responsible for these charges and responsible for bringing these charges forward. They had actually met with the police officers that were involved. There's a specialized unit within the Phoenix PD called the Tactical Response Unit. This is the group of officers that responds to protests. And they had meetings in advance of these protests. We don't know exactly what was discussed in those meetings, but we do know the timing of them coincided with these targeted arrests and with the perjured grand jury testimony. So that is something that not only are we investigating, but that following the reporting by ABC 15, the elected county attorney, Alistair Adele, hired a former Maricopa County Superior Court judge to conduct an independent investigation within her own office about how these charges happened, because of the public specter of the prosecutor's office colluding with the police department to charge protesters as gang members.
Now, the bottom line here is that there has been outrage by the press, by local political leaders, and by community folks about how awful this was. And that the follow-on to that was that there's several concurrent investigations going on right now as a result of the outrage by the public and by leaders and by the press and by the judiciary, I might add. And so now who's being investigated and why? Heather?
Yeah, so since all of this has come to light, and since the public has really gotten to know what's happening, which is that the Phoenix Police Department and the Maricopa County Attorney's Office colluded to bring a set of false felony charges against BLM demonstrators and protesters for the sole purpose of trying to silence, intimidate, and disappear that movement. For the sole purpose of trying to silence, intimidate, and disappear individuals who they believe are their political opponents. Once the public found this out, there's a sufficient outrage. Obviously, there was a lot of pressure on these institutions to do something about this. So 14 officers have been placed on desk duty and are under investigation within the Phoenix Police Department. The lead prosecutor who brought all of these cases forward, a woman by the name of April Sponsel. I want her to become very notorious, but April Sponsel was placed on leave. And there have been three.
The deputy prosecutor for this jurisdiction, isn't she?
Yes, she
so
was.
She's under Bar Association investigation. She's under a criminal investigation. And she's under what other kind of investigation?
I don't know if she's under criminal investigation. She should be, but she is being investigated by the bar. There have been multiple bar complaints initiated against her for her actions over the course of the summer, her involvement in these protest cases. And she was placed on leave by the Maricopa County Attorney's Office and is under active investigation by Judge Steinle, who's investigating whether or not these charges that were brought forward were proper, and if they weren't, what should happen as a result of that.
That's the retired judge who was brought in to do an internal investigation of the prosecutor's office?
Yep. And then there's
that's two.
That's two. And then there's two separate investigations being conducted against the Phoenix Police Department. So one is being conducted by Ballard Spahr, which is a national law firm who's coming in to do an investigation into the handling of these protests. And then another, or actually Ballard Spahr is investigating the Tactical Response Unit in particular. And then there's another police reform group, quote unquote, who has come in to do an investigation of the handling of these protests. So far there's been 4 internal investigations that have been launched. 14 police officers have been placed on desk duty. 1 prosecutor has been placed on leave.
Wow. So after this outrageous conduct against the protesters was revealed for what it was, there was a strong response to that outrage. Yep. And what are you guys getting ready to do, Steve?
Yeah, we are in the process. We're still investigating. But we're in the process of preparing multiple class actions, but 2 class actions in particular. One against Phoenix PD for these mass arrests arising out of the May 30 copy and paste probable cause statements and the mass arrests of 114 people that had not committed any criminal acts. And the second one, a class action, which is, I think, and you would be the authority on this, Billy, given your civil rights career, but I think is a relatively unprecedented class action against a prosecutorial agency from the perspective of prosecutors typically have absolute immunity. And they only waive that absolute immunity in very rare circumstances. But one is when they act as police officers. And we believe what has happened in this case and the basis for this class action against the Maricopa County attorney will be that the county attorney's office waived their prosecutorial immunity by engaging with the Phoenix Police Department to direct and target these protesters for arrest and to fabricate charges against them. So that's what's happening legally right now. And part of, I should back up, and there was one piece here that got left out inadvertently, but part of the public outrage over all of this, and part of what's really facilitated, I think, the real anger at Phoenix PD, and particularly this tactical response unit, goes back to the basis for that Ballard Spar investigation that Heather described. The main reason why the Phoenix city manager hired Ballard Spar, which is a large national law firm out of Philadelphia, to conduct this investigation, was an ABC 15 report about a challenge coin that this specialty unit had created. Challenge coin apparently is of military origins, is something that military folks will create for the purpose of showing what unit they worked for or what their rank was, and they'll show them to each other. And there's a long-standing tradition where if two military guys are at a bar, they throw down their challenge coins, and whoever has the higher rank will get free drinks from the person with the lower rank.
So these are actual coins.
It's an actual coin, yeah. It's a the size of maybe like a $50.
And they're created to commemorate something, right?
Exactly.
So what did these coins say?
So these coins had a few things on them. One was a drawing of a protester being shot in the genitals with a tear gas canister, which had happened at a 2017 protest against Donald Trump. And it was a drawing of a very famous incident where this protester was shot. And on one side of the coin was that drawing, and it said, "Making America Great Again, one nut at a time." And on the other side of the coin, it said, "Good night, left nut," which, when it was originally reported by the media, the Mr. Biscobing didn't really know what that meant. I didn't know what it meant. Heather didn't know what it meant. We just thought it was kind of a, some kind of stupid slogan.
Yeah.
And then once it was reported and it went online, and Biscobing tweeted this, there was a lot of feedback that said, "Hey, this is a neo-Nazi slogan." And a lot of us were shocked by that. But then a little bit of research revealed there is a neo-Nazi kind of dog whistle slogan, "Good night, left side," which is a sanitized version of the noted neo-Nazi slogan, "Good night, white pride." So this was, on one side, Trump paraphernalia, and on the other side, neo-Nazi paraphernalia created and distributed by Phoenix police officers, along with the drawing of a protester who'd been brutalized. This was distributed within this unit, and these are the same officers that were responsible for all of these targeted arrests. And that really caused outrage and has led to a lot of this internal investigation.
So there's a neo-Nazi element of the police force. That's not surprising to those of us who've dug deep into some of the motivations that police have towards citizens. And concurrently, what was announced today in the news media was that you all are having a right-wing sponsored recount to find all of the fraudulent votes that they couldn't find in time to sue anybody about it, but they're going to try to create so that the attention is deflected from voter suppression, which is a big deal in Arizona right now.
Yep.
So just give us a couple of sentences about how bad it is in Arizona under these voter suppression laws that are being proposed.
Well, there have been, the Arizona legislature is a notoriously awful right-wing body and has been for many, many years. This is the same body that passed SB 1070. And in the wake of the elections, where Arizona, quote unquote, went blue for the first time, even though we only went blue in terms of federal offices, not any of our local ones. But in the wake of that election and in the wake of these protests, Arizona's response has been to try to suppress the vote. There are bills to kick, hundreds of thousands of people off of the early voter list, and to make it more difficult to get onto the early voter list and to stay on the early voter list, which is a big deal because that's one of the easiest ways to vote.
Just, if you can, just give us the list of things they're trying to do.
Yeah, so they're trying to, like you said, they're trying to initiate this recount of the election. So right now they are.
And by the way, they've hired a right-wing Trump-based organization to do the recount.
Yes, they have.
Supervise it. Yeah.
Yep. So they're initiating a recount of the election to try to prove that it was stolen. They're trying to kick hundreds of thousands of people off of the early voter list. And they are also trying to criminalize protests. So there's a bill right now that is being debated in the Senate. It's called HB 2309. And that bill has created a handful of new felonies for individuals who participate at protests, which is in direct response to the uprising this past year.
Wow. And folks, that's why my law firm has decided to get involved by helping everybody who's initiating this, both Heather and Steve. And we're proud to be involved. This is a serious undertaking by these lawyers in Arizona, and we're going to help. Wow. Well, thank you very much for explaining all of that to the rest of the country. In addition to what's happening in everybody's home state, in states like Arizona, which have been traditionally red states, meaning that in the past they had a positive relationship to the institution of slavery. We're seeing a reemergence of the racism that's been there all the time, because nobody ever tried to convince these folks that racism was bad. And so they've been expressing and acting on racist views for hundreds of years in Arizona. And now the chickens are just coming out of the chicken coop, and you're seeing it firsthand. Well, do we have time to take any questions from the listening audience, or have we basically run the course?
We have some time. Let's check in with our moderators.
We don't have any questions on the Facebook Live page.
Okay, you too?
Sorry about that. No questions on the YouTube either.
Okay, Twitch?
Ma'am, no questions from Twitch.
All right, show page, our Facebook show page. What about Real STL News?
Nothing in the real STL News.
Okay, excellent. All right. Any questions from our interns here? I know I have a question.
Go ahead.
What I would like to know is, I know that Florida is introducing legislation around prosecuting protesters, and there was one other state that I saw last night in the news. I don't know if it was Ohio or Iowa. Do you see this moving fast across the country in terms of this prosecuting protesters and introducing legislation? I mean, how and if so, what do we need to do at an advocacy level? How do we get folks more informed and aware about what's happening?
So we definitely have seen this as a trend that's starting to pick up nationwide.
Right.
This past summer, I think prosecutors in Arizona got the idea to charge BLM demonstrators as gang members because this had happened in other jurisdictions over the course of this summer. And you see across the country prosecutors shooting up these sort of test balloon cases to try to see how far they can push the law, how far they can push the facts, how much they can punish these protesters and these demonstrators. And so you saw test balloons sort of go up all across the country. None of them were ultimately successful. But I think ultimately you're going to have prosecutors who still try to do this and are encouraged to do this and emboldened to do this. And they definitely were encouraged and emboldened to do this under the Trump administration, because the Department of Justice was directly involved in putting together these sort of heavy-handed response to protests. Hopefully that'll change under a Biden administration and a Biden Department of Justice. Hopefully they'll send a different message, but I think they'll continue to be emboldened. But across the country, you have seen these bills be introduced to further criminalize protests, to create from whole cloth these brand new felonies that'll give police and prosecutors all the ammunition that they need to target protesters and to put them in jail or prison for long stints of time. So like you said, a bill just passed in Florida. There's bills being introduced in Arizona. I think there's multiple bills nationwide. In addition to the bills that have been introduced over the past 4 years, including the bills, there have been many states that have authorized individuals to drive their vehicles through protests.
Yeah.
And so
one of them was here in Missouri.
Yep. Yep.
Wow. How sad. How sad. Now we have a new administration with Merrick Garland recently announcing as the new Attorney General that he's going to look into the policing patterns in Minnesota in the wake of George Floyd. And what is going on in Arizona sounds like a much worse response than that happened in Minnesota. So maybe we can prevail in getting first our new head of the civil division who brought in the cavalry in Baltimore in the wake of Freddie Gray to get an investigation, a federal investigation of what's going on in Arizona. That sounds like a next logical step. So stay tuned, folks. We're going to keep you posted about what's going on in Arizona's suppression of protesters. It's a very, very sad thing. Very sad. Thank you for coming on and explaining this serious problem in Arizona to our listeners. And we'll have you back as things progress. Hopefully with some good news about federal investigation, hopefully with some good news about filing the right lawsuit against these folks and getting some preliminary rulings that will help out in stamping this out and preventing people from being arrested for no reason whatsoever. And, you know, everybody in the nation should know that you have a constitutional right to assembly, to protest the government's actions. And that is enshrined in the Constitution. It was a major part of the Constitution because of what had happened to the colonists back in the 1700s and the 1600s when England was still in charge. And these rights have to be respected. And they've got to be respected first and foremost by local government. And there seems to have been a real breakdown in the respect for these rights and a serious effort at criminalizing people just because they exercise their right to peaceful assembly. Now, were there any property damage incidents that followed these demonstrations in Arizona?
I believe during the initial nights of protests, there was some limited property damage. Obviously, the police and the city government really overblew that. But for the most part, these were largely peaceful demonstrations. Interestingly enough, there were a couple of right-wing demonstrations during the same time. As is famously known, there was a white nationalist group who raided our county recorder's office during the election because they were convinced that the county recorder's office was stealing the election. So they actually broke into the building, and no one from those protests was arrested.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
Yeah, sound familiar.
Anyone?
Right. Okay. All right, we've reached the point where we need to kind of wind down a little bit. You guys have been marvelous. I mean, this has been some really serious, hard-hitting information for our listeners to receive. And it's given me some ideas on some things that we're going to do. Of course, we'll be blogging about this. We will also be creating an audio blog as well, so we can disseminate this information widely and far as we can. And at this point, I'd like to thank Mr. Benedetto and Ms. Hamel for being with us today. And of course, our illustrious moderator, Billy Murphy. Any last words?
Thank you.
Any last
Yes, look, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And if we let this happen in Arizona and it becomes a successful tactic enshrined in the law and immune from retaliation by a court of justice, then we are setting a precedent for what can become the new laws in other states.
Right.
And just because we've won some victories doesn't mean we won the war against racism, the war against women, the war against people of color who come from Mexico or wherever, anywhere in Central America. We haven't won these wars yet. And so we have to keep fighting until this is stopped. And we have a long way to go in Arizona, everybody. Long way to go. And we'll keep you posted in future shows about the successes and failures of our efforts to stop it, to stamp it out, to make it go away.
That's right. Thank you. Now we have one quick announcement before we close out. We have had a tremendous response to an episode that we did on mental health and the trauma in African-American communities. And we have a survey that we'd like to introduce to our audience. And I will give Reggie the floor to give some more details about that, and then we'll return to close out.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. Yes. Following that, we have created a survey following up the mental health episode. Another Adler graduate student, Claire Reeser, and doctoral student, Asia Hall, and I have all created this survey to help raise awareness, but also come up with different subject matter and questions that we can have for our future mental health episode that we have on the show. So we asked all of the Justice Beat family, if you can, please take some time out of your day to complete this survey. You can find it in the comment section of all the different streaming platforms from Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, and the Real STL News. Please and thank you.
Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you, Reggie.
All right. So thank you once again. This has been tremendous. And I want to thank our Justice Beat family as well as our Justice Beat family on Real STL News for joining us again for another monthly edition of our Legal Hour with Billy Murphy and guests, Mr. Benedetto and Ms. Hamel. Thank you. God bless. And we'll see you next week.
God bless you all.
Thank you for listening to the Justice Beat. If you like what you heard and found the information useful, then support the Justice Beat Talk Show by spreading the word and telling a friend.